All right, so we're back now, and Cleona is going to be interviewing the founding member of Missing Justice.
Maya, can you tell us about Missing Justice, how relevant it is and what's happening at the moment?
Yeah, Missing Justice is a group that started in March of 2009. It's based in Montreal. The name is short for Justice for Missing and Murdered Indigenous Women, just to be clear. If you're a Native woman in Canada, you're 5 times more likely than any other woman to die as the result of violence. Just to share a little stat with you, if we were to take the official number of missing and murdered Native women, which is currently at 582, and translate that to the population of non-Native women in Canada, it would be equal to over 20,000 women. So we're talking about an epidemic of violence here that is just completely out of control and mostly stays out of the media and mostly remains unspoken about. But our group was started to sort of raise awareness in student and community populations in Montreal, particularly, about what the issues are and why they exist, and to bring people that are directly affected to speak about these issues. Because education is definitely the first step. Most of the Canadian population has no idea that this is a problem. And those that have any idea that it's a problem don't realize that it's a problem outside of British Columbia or the Highway of Tears, which is the most infamous, definitely the most infamous case of violence against Native women in Canada. But it's actually an ongoing cross-country issue, and it's getting worse. And it's particularly relevant because right now, until 2 days ago, the official number was 521. And 60 names were just added to the list, pretty much at the exact same time that the Government of Canada is deciding to take all funding away from the very researchers who've done the work to come up with this number to begin with. They're the only people who are doing the work. Basically, the Native Women's Association of Canada and their Sisters in Spirit campaign over the last 5 years have done this research and come up with statistics, because before 2004 there were no stats about this issue whatsoever.
And who's funding Missing Justice?
Missing Justice is pretty much self-funded. We hold fundraisers, we apply for money with different sort of progressive leftist organizations in Montreal, but it's mainly dollar to dollar sort of. We're holding a fundraiser actually in the coming month as well. But yeah, it's...
And are there international companies or organizations who are aware of this situation? For instance, UN or Amnesty?
Yeah, Amnesty International. The thing with this issue is that it's definitely blowing up in the media right now, and for good reason. You know, the funding's being torn away. As we speak, the funding for Sisters in Spirit has already ended because the government doesn't think there's a good enough reason to continue research, even though 62 names have just been added to the list. But this has been going on for decades, and it's not only grassroots activists, Indigenous and non-Indigenous alike, who've been bringing it up. It's also really high-profile orgs like Amnesty and like the UN. Amnesty International got together with the Native Women's Association of Canada back in 2004 to do a report called Stolen Sisters, and they did a lot of amazing research, came up with the number, 521, and acknowledged and also acknowledged that the number was inaccurately low. Estimates by activists are more in the thousands, and Amnesty themselves have acknowledged that that's probably the case because the means of research are so limited, and so is the funding for the research. And then you have the United Nations, who in November of 2009 finally gave Canada an ultimatum and said, okay, this is a human rights issue. Native women in Canada are so highly at risk that it's a human rights issue, and so we're going to give you until November 2010 to report back on why it is that the majority of these known about cases are unsolved, and largely uninvestigated, and what's going to be done to fix this issue. And Canada finally reported back in February of 2010, managed to escape any sort of media attention whatsoever. They didn't post it online or anything, and basically pointed to the funding they'd already been the minimal funding they'd already been giving to the programs they'd already been funding, such as Sisters in Spirit, which they're now cutting the funding to, and said, this is what we're doing, this is all the amazing work we've done, and they actually fabricated an amount of funding and said they were giving more funding to the Native Women's Association than they actually were. And I don't understand why this never got leaked to the media, but it's now been corrected and still hasn't really been picked up in corporate media. So.
And what are the suggestions that have been happening? What are people saying, or what is the cause for these women and their disappearances?
Yeah, well, there's no really easy answer. It's all the studies that have been done by both grassroots activists and higher up federally funded orgs like the Native Women's Association and Amnesty have all pointed to a really profound level of systemic racism and sexism. It's what we have here is very highly racialized and sexualized violence for the most part, it's linked historically, obviously, to the relationship between the Canadian government and First Nations governments, and it's linked to the ongoing sort of tense relationship between First Nations people and people who identify as Canadian citizens. What Missing Justice is striving to do is to raise awareness about what's going on, first and foremost, because people have no clue. And second of all, to put pressure on the government in places where it's needed, with direct actions, with demonstrations, and so on. So, for example, with funding that's being cut, one thing we did really recently was the Aboriginal Healing Foundation has been cut entirely. The Aboriginal Healing Foundation is a network of 134 Native-run, community-based projects across the country that are helping Native people in their communities deal with trauma from residential schools, whether it's people that directly were abused in residential schools or the children of those people, because the effects are just long-lasting when you have a whole generation of people who've been sexually and physically abused, and some of them who've been killed. And this issue itself feeds into the issue of missing and murdered Native women as well, because a lot of the fact that women in these communities are so vulnerable to violence comes from, violence that happened to their parents and their grandparents as well. It's been shown in studies that this makes one more vulnerable. So all this funding's been cut as of March 31st, and we did a sit-in outside of the Minister of Indian Affairs office in Parliament in Ottawa to get them to pledge to renew the funding to the Aboriginal Healing Foundation. Our very own, Montreal's very own Native Women's Shelter of Montreal, which has been operating since 1987, lost a third of their funding with the cuts to the Aboriginal Healing Foundation. And they lost a sexual assault counselor at the same time. And I spoke to the director of the shelter myself, and she told me that of the over 200 women that they serve on a regular basis, the vast majority have been sexually abused. So now they have no sexual assault counselor. So you can see how the issues are linked. Residential schools, poverty on reserves, violence against Indigenous women. And I think it's really important now more than ever for people to, write in and call in to Chuck Straw, the Minister of Indian Affairs office, and, tell them how important it is for the funding to be renewed. I mean, they've been told, but they need to be told more. And to speak to local Native organizations who've been affected by these cuts, figure out what next steps need to be taken.
Do you have an online site?
Yeah. There's a site. It's missingjustice.ca. And our group actually meets once a week in Montreal, alternating Thursdays and Fridays normally, at the 2110 Centre for Gender Advocacy, 2110 Mackay. We have open meetings. Anyone's welcome to come and get involved in organizing events, in starting a new project. It's been talked about. We've had discussions about going into high schools and CEGEPs and adding this sort of content to their curriculum, bringing in people from directly affected communities to talk to younger students as well, bringing younger kids to visit reserves as well. just to sort of enhance the whole educational experience that needs to happen for things to change.
Okay.
Yeah.
Thanks very much. It's
No
been
problem.
wonderful. And
Thank
back
you.
to Jonathan.
All right, well, thanks a lot, Maya, for coming into the studio today.
Thanks for having me.
Let me see. To get CUTV news automatically each week, subscribe via RSS or email on our website, and tune in next week where you'll get English news from an alternative perspective. Thanks.